So can you game on an M2 Mac Mini? Is it any good? Let's find out. Welcome back to the channel. So what I wanted to do in this video is I want to find out if an M2 Mac Mini can actually game. A lot of people ask me this all the time and I'm like, I don't know. So what I did is I went ahead and I put together a list of 9 different games. Now these are going to be a list of some old games all the way up to some new games, even like a 2023 game. And I'm going to show you the frame rates that I got, all right? Frames per second. Now listen here, because this is kind of important. I'm going to show you also the settings that I use on the screen as I'm talking about it. I could test millions of different things in this, all right? And I only tested very specific things because there's really millions of different options. So you have to look at the settings and then you're going to get that specific frame rate, and that's the way I tested it. So just keep that in mind. But beyond that, let's get into it. I'm going to go through 9 different games with those specific settings, which I'll show you, and let's find out how everything did here. I'm kind of interested myself. Let's get into it. All right, before I get into that though, I need to tell you the test system. It's the M2 Mac Mini, but 16 gigs of RAM. That's important. 16 gigs of RAM I used. Also, I'm going to go with the 8-core CPU and the 10-core GPU, so just keep that in mind as well. So if you have that exact test configuration, it's not the Pro model, it's basically just the normal M2, but 16 gigs of RAM, then you should get these values also. All right, first game is going to be the easiest, Minecraft, all right? Everyone asks me this, well, can it do Minecraft? Of course it can. So let's look at the settings. At 1080p fancy settings, default distance settings, it averages 425 frames per second. 425 frames per second. So it's going to just blow that away. That's not a problem. But if you do some small changes to it, it's kind of interesting. So if we do 1080p fancy, and we do basically the same distance settings as before, but we add, this is called Sliders Vibrant Shaders version 1.5, it can only do 50 frames per second. That means the picture is going to be a lot better, but it goes from 425 down to 50 by adding some of those little additional things. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be playing Minecraft. All right, the next game, which I love, is going to be Dirt 4. Now this actually uses Rosetta 2 kind of to render it. Don't worry about that. Minecraft used native, meaning it didn't use Rosetta, but this game will actually use Rosetta 2 to kind of compile everything. And don't worry about it, it kind of does it behind the scenes. So Dirt 4, what do we get for the settings here? This is a great racing game. So the first thing I kind of tested was 1080p, VSync on, and then I capped it. There's a cap, 60 frames per second cap you can set up in the actual settings, and then I use ultra settings on that, and I was able to get the full 60 frames per second, totally playable, all right? Then I went in ahead and I did 2160p, so we're going way up from the 1080, 2160p, and I did VSync enabled. Then I did the 30 frames per second cap just to see if we could get there, and I did high settings, and I was able to get just 30 frames per second, no problem at all. So if you have those different types of settings in there, you're gonna get a playable game in both scenarios. Obviously 60 frames per second is a lot better, but you can still play it at 30. I did it myself, and it's not a bad experience. All right, the next game is a 2003 game, and this isn't that hard for some reason. It only plays in 1080p anyway, but I was actually shocked by this. So if we look at this game, it's NBA 2K23 AE, and this is going to be running native. It's not even basically going to be running Rosetta 2 in the background. And this was able to do, it's a 1080p, the setting. It's an ultra high setting, so it's going to be a beautiful, beautiful game. And this was able to muster out 118 frames per second on the average. 118 frames per second on a 2023 game, not too bad for the M2. All right, the next game is going to be Resident Evil 8 in the Village, I guess they call it. And this is basically the native, again, it's not using Rosetta. This is going to be a native type setting. And let's talk about this. So the 1080p max settings gets 45 frames per second, totally playable, not bad. I mean, obviously there's going to be a couple hiccups here and there, but overall not too bad. And then 1080p, turn VSync on, so make sure VSync's on in this case, 60 frames per second cap, so you have to set that up in the settings as well. And then Metal FX, you want to have in the settings, and quality is going to be max. We were able to get 57 frames per second using those settings, so it's a great actually way to do it. You can play fully almost at 60 frames per second. That was the average. It actually went higher sometimes, so totally playable if you want to play that game. And at the end of the day, I recommend either of those because they're both fun. The game's actually a really fun game. All right, the next one is going to be called Humankind. It's going to be running native again, and this is a turn-based strategy game for all the people that don't know about this. I think it's got a big following, but if you don't know, sometimes these games actually have a hard time rendering for some reason. Long story short, 1080p, fast is the settings, and then I get, those are just the two settings I used, and I get 39 to 40 frames per second on average. Sometimes it goes lower, sometimes it goes higher, but totally playable. And here we have a classic, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is also going to use Rosetta 2 to kind of render behind the scenes. So I did 3 different settings here. The first one is 1080p high settings, 35 frames per second. Not too bad, right? Then I did 1080p medium settings. You only get a little bit more. I only got like 38 frames per second, somewhere in that range. So it barely went up, but you get a little bit, obviously a little less quality. If you really want to play this game good, you have to do kind of all these different settings. If you do 900p, and 900p is like, I think 1600 by 900 or something, the resolution, still not that bad. But 900p, medium settings, motion blur off, pure hair on, and low settings, you get 56 frames per second. It's totally playable at that, at that frame rate. And obviously it's not gonna look as sharp, but still totally playable. All right, the next game is going to be called Dying Light. And if you're not familiar with this, first of all, it's going to be running Rosetta 2. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a survival horror zombie type game. And it's basically a very bloody game. So a lot of like axes and everything. Anyways, I did 2 different settings here. 1080p is going to be high settings. So 1080p high, 82 frames per second, obviously totally playable. And then 1440p high settings again, 51 average frames per second, so 51, not too bad, right? That's totally playable as well. I mean, you might get a little hiccup here and there, but overall, both of those settings work fine. All right, the next game is funny, Farming Simulator, all right? And this is gonna be running natively, so if you wanna play this game, here are your options here. So, all right, in this case, if you do 1080p, VSync on, high settings, 50 frames per second, not sure why it's hard to do a farming game, but there you go, 50 frames per second. If you do 1080p, VSync on, and you do medium settings, you get a little better, 56 to 57 frames per second. All right, and now the favorite I think everyone knows about. It's an old game, obviously, World of Warcraft. So what do you get with this? It's obviously, everyone knows this game. I'm showing you pictures as we're talking. Now, who knows? I mean, this is a game I think people still play because it's just a cult following. At the end of the day, I've never played it that much, but I have some friends that always play it. So what are the settings? 1080p max settings, you get 58 frames per second, totally playable. Obviously, it's close to the 60, but not quite there yet. And then 1080p high settings, you basically get 80 frames per second. So just do the high. You're 20 over the 60, so you're at 80 frames per second on that high setting there with 1080p. Totally playable again. It's a great game. I was actually just fooling around with it and it's fun to play, so even now. All right, so what do you think about all this? Pretty crazy, right? Now granted, if you're a PC person, and I have a PC sitting over there, you're probably gonna want to game on a PC. It's always gonna be faster if you have the right graphics card and everything else. But I just wanted to know, can we actually game on an M2 Mac Mini? And the question is, yes, you can definitely do it. It's not gonna be, totally the best, textures and everything else that you're playing with. You have to maybe dumb down some of the settings, but I had fun. It's immersive. Obviously the screen is good on all the Macs you play on and stuff like that, so there's no problems there. You're not gonna always have, the top maybe competitive experience, but overall you can play a lot of these games, even at the 40 frames per second, they work really well. So just wanna show people that, obviously get a PC if you're a gamer, but if you just wanna game on a Mac sometimes, and sometimes you wanna go back through some of the older titles and stuff like that, even some newer titles work great. So let me know what you guys think. Was this something that you expected? Was this something that you would actually think was even possible? We know this isn't for gaming. So in the end, let me know your comments and let me know what games you might wanna test later. I think I have more videos coming out soon where I'm gonna have a whole bunch of other games if you guys like these or if I get a lot of views, because I need people to like my videos. But I can test a whole bunch of other games and I might do that just to show people what's available out there. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more specific games and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.